If you think Aubrey Plaza's bizarre paranormal confession was just part of her dark humor, you're dead wrong. Because her neighbor claims that what happened inside that house almost made her move out overnight. The interview room was deliberately sparse, no windows, no decorations, just a single overhead light casting long shadows across cream-colored walls. The camera was positioned at an angle, capturing only the silhouette of the woman sitting across from the interviewer. Her identity had been carefully protected at her own insistence, her voice slightly distorted through digital modulation, pitched just low enough to make identification impossible. This wasn't the kind of interview someone gives lightly. This was the testimony of someone who had carried a burden of knowledge for too long, someone who had watched the public dismiss a cry for help as nothing more than celebrity eccentricity, and who could no longer stay silent. Her name, for the purposes of this account, was Elena Morales. She was 43 years old, a freelance graphic designer who had lived in the upscale Los Angeles neighborhood for nearly 7 years. She had a husband, 2 teenage children, and until recently, she had considered herself a rational person who didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or anything that couldn't be explained by logic and science. That changed when Aubrey Plaza moved in next door. Elena began with a long, shaky breath that the microphone picked up clearly despite the voice distortion. When she spoke, her words came slowly, carefully chosen, as if she'd rehearsed this confession 1,000 times in her mind but still struggled to make it real. "People think she was joking on that talk show," Elena said, her distorted voice carrying an edge of frustration. Everyone laughed. They thought it was classic Aubrey Plaza, that deadpan humor, that dark comedy persona she's built her career on. But those of us who live next to her, we know exactly why she said it. And we know she wasn't joking. The interviewer, an investigative journalist who had spent months tracking down witnesses willing to speak about the incident, leaned forward slightly. "When did you first realize something was wrong?" Elena was quiet for a moment, her silhouette shifting in the dim light. "It started months before that talk show appearance. Maybe 6 or 7 months earlier. And it wasn't anything dramatic at first, nothing you could point to and say, that's definitely supernatural. Just small things. Uncomfortable things that you try to rationalize away because the alternative is too frightening to consider." She described how the first signs were so subtle that she'd almost missed them entirely. Lights flickering in Aubrey's house when the actress came home late at night, not the normal flicker of old wiring, but a rhythmic pulsing that seemed almost intentional, like Morse code being transmitted through the electrical system. "My bedroom window faces her driveway," Elena explained. "I work late sometimes, and I'd see her pull in around midnight or 1 in the morning. The moment her car entered the property, the lights inside would start doing this dance. That's the only way I can describe it. They'd pulse in sequence, starting from the ground floor and moving upward, like something was tracking her movement through the house." At first, Elena had attributed it to faulty wiring or some kind of smart home system malfunction. Los Angeles homes, especially in the more affluent neighborhoods, were notorious for having overly complicated automated systems that frequently glitched. But as the weeks progressed, the phenomena escalated beyond what any electrical problem could explain. Doors began behaving strangely. Elena would be in her backyard, tending to her garden or simply enjoying the California sunshine, and she would hear the distinct sound of Aubrey's back door slamming shut. But when she looked over, the door would be standing wide open, swaying slightly on its hinges despite the absence of any wind. "It happened at least 3 or 4 times a week," Elena said. "I'd hear the slam, look over, and the door would be open. Then, maybe 30 seconds later, it would slowly swing closed on its own. No breeze. No visible explanation. Just, closing. Even more disturbing were the shadows. Elena's teenage daughter, Sophia, had been the first to notice them. The girl's bedroom window also faced Aubrey's property, and she'd complained to her mother about seeing dark shapes moving through the actress's upstairs hallway during the day. Sophia kept insisting she saw someone walking back and forth past the windows, Elena recalled. But the shadows were wrong. They moved too smoothly, too quickly. And they appeared in the hallway even when the sun was at the wrong angle to cast shadows there. I tried to dismiss it as Sophia's imagination, or maybe reflections from passing cars. But then I started seeing them too. The shadows seemed to have substance despite being incorporeal. They weren't just the absence of light, they were presences, entities that absorbed light and created pockets of darkness that shouldn't exist in a sun-drenched hallway at 2 in the afternoon. Elena initially assumed the stress of Hollywood life was taking its toll on her famous neighbor. Aubrey Plaza had built a career on playing dark, sardonic characters, and the demands of maintaining that public persona while navigating the cutthroat entertainment industry couldn't be easy. Who wouldn't be mentally and emotionally drained under those circumstances? But then the real nightmare started. And after that night, no amount of rationalization could explain away what was happening in the house next door. It was a Tuesday. Elena remembered the date exactly, March 17th. She'd gone to bed around 11:30, exhausted after a long day of work and dealing with her son's college application stress. Her husband, Marcus, had been asleep for over an hour, snoring softly beside her. At exactly 3:17 a.m., they were both jolted awake by a sound that Elena would later describe as, the worst thing I've ever heard. It was banging. Violent, rhythmic banging that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But it wasn't on their house. Elena's first panicked thought was that someone was trying to break in, but within seconds she realized the sound was coming from next door, from inside Aubrey's walls. It wasn't someone knocking or pounding on a door, Elena said, her voice dropping lower despite the distortion. It was inside the structure. Like someone, or something, was trapped between the walls and was desperately trying to get out. 3 loud bangs, then a pause. Then 3 more. Over and over, moving through the house. Marcus had grabbed his phone to call 911, but before he could dial, they heard something else. Something that made the banging seem almost benign by comparison. Whispers. Not a single voice, Elena emphasized, her silhouette leaning forward intensely. Not a man or a woman. But something, layered. Multiple voices speaking simultaneously, overlapping and interweaving like a demonic choir. The words, if they were words, weren't in any language I recognized. They had this wet, slithering quality, like they were sliding through the air rather than being spoken normally. The whispers seemed to bleed through the walls, seeping into Elena's bedroom like an auditory infection. She and Marcus sat frozen in their bed, clutching each other, too terrified to move or even turn on the lights. The banging continued in its rhythmic pattern, accompanied now by those horrifying layered whispers that seemed to be coming from multiple locations simultaneously. The cacophony lasted for approximately 8 minutes. Elena checked her phone's timestamp afterward, and then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise, heavy and expectant, as if something was waiting to see what they would do next. Neither Elena nor Marcus slept for the rest of that night. At dawn, Elena worked up the courage to text Aubrey, asking if everything was okay. The response came 3 hours later, a simple, yes, why? She didn't hear it, Elena said, and the interviewer could hear the disbelief still present in her voice. Or she was pretending she didn't. But how could she not hear that? It was so loud that my children woke up on the other side of our house. How could she sleep through something that violent happening inside her own walls? That incident marked a turning point. After that night, Elena began paying much closer attention to her neighbor and the house next door. What she observed over the following weeks painted a deeply disturbing picture. Aubrey Plaza seemed to change. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to someone watching as carefully as Elena was. The actress, known for her energetic if sardonic public appearances, began moving differently. She walked slower, with a kind of careful deliberation, as if she was constantly aware of something following her. Her usual quick, purposeful stride was replaced by hesitant steps, frequent glances over her shoulder, and a hunched posture that spoke of exhaustion or fear. She avoided people, Elena said. Before all this, she'd wave if she saw me outside. Sometimes we'd chat for a few minutes about neighborhood stuff, nothing deep, just friendly neighbor conversation. But after that March night, she wouldn't make eye contact. If she saw me in my yard, she'd quickly get in her car and leave, or she'd retreat back inside her house. The actress also stopped spending time outdoors. Her backyard had a beautiful patio area with comfortable furniture and a fire pit, and Elena had often seen her out there in the evenings, reading scripts or talking on the phone. But now the outdoor spaces sat unused, the furniture gathering dust and leaves. It was like she was afraid to be outside, Elena observed. Like she didn't feel safe anywhere that wasn't enclosed by walls. But the irony is, I don't think she felt safe inside either. One incident in particular stuck with Elena, haunting her dreams for weeks afterward. It was a Saturday afternoon, unseasonably warm for early April. Elena had been watering her flower beds when she noticed Aubrey standing at her kitchen window. Nothing unusual about that, people look out their windows all the time. But Aubrey wasn't looking out. She was standing completely motionless, her face pressed close to the glass, staring intently at something behind Elena. The actress's expression was blank, almost catatonic, but her eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed on whatever she was seeing with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. Elena felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm afternoon sun. Slowly, she turned around to see what had captured Aubrey's attention so completely. There was nothing there. Just Elena's empty driveway, her parked car, the street beyond, and the houses across the way. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would warrant that kind of intense, frozen attention. When Elena turned back toward Aubrey's kitchen window, the actress was gone. But for the rest of that day, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Aubrey had been staring at something very real, something invisible to Elena but terrifyingly present to her neighbor. I think that's when I really understood, Elena said quietly. Whatever was in that house wasn't just making noises or creating shadows. It was showing itself to her. And whatever she was seeing, it was so horrible that it literally paralyzed her. The neighborhood disturbances continued to escalate. Other residents began noticing odd things, though most were reluctant to speak publicly about their experiences. A couple 3 houses down reported hearing what sounded like screaming coming from Aubrey's property in the middle of the night, but when they investigated, all the lights were off and the house appeared empty. A dog walker who regularly passed by at dawn said that every dog on his route, animals who normally paid no attention to the plaza residents, would suddenly refuse to walk past the property. They would plant their feet, hackles raised, and whine or growl at something invisible, forcing their walker to cross to the other side of the street. Even the postal carrier mentioned something to Elena one day. He told me that the house felt wrong, Elena recalled. He said that when he approached the front door to deliver packages, he would get this overwhelming sense of being watched, not by security cameras or by someone inside, but by something hostile and predatory. He started leaving Aubrey's packages at the curb rather than walking up to the door. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared the neighborhood for what happened on the night of April 23rd. Elena was downstairs that evening, working late on a client project that was due the next morning. Marcus and the kids had gone to bed hours earlier. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of her computer and the occasional click of her mouse. At 2:47 a.m., according to the timestamp on her computer, a sound ripped through the night that made Elena's blood turn to ice. A scream. A piercing, agonized scream that seemed to contain more pain than any human throat should be capable of producing. It wasn't the scream of someone who was frightened, this was the scream of someone experiencing unimaginable physical torment. Elena jumped up so fast she knocked over her chair. Within seconds, she heard doors opening throughout her house as Marcus and both kids emerged from their bedrooms, their faces pale and frightened. What the hell was that? Marcus demanded, already grabbing his phone. Through her front window, Elena could see lights turning on in houses up and down the street. Other neighbors had heard it too. 3 people were already outside in their pajamas and robes, looking around frantically for the source of that horrible sound. Elena stepped out onto her front porch, her heart hammering in her chest. All eyes were drawn to Aubrey Plaza's house, and what they saw there defied logical explanation. Every light in the house was flickering violently, rapidly strobing on and off in a chaotic pattern that hurt to watch. It wasn't the synchronized pulsing Elena had observed before, this was frantic, desperate, like the house's electrical system was having a seizure. It looked like someone was flipping the breaker on and off as fast as they could, Elena said. But the pattern was too fast, too random. No human hand could move that quickly. The strobing lights illuminated the house's windows in rapid bursts, creating a disorienting effect where watchers could almost see shapes moving inside, tall, elongated silhouettes that seemed to writhe and twist in the flashing light. Marcus called 911. So did at least 4 other neighbors. Within 6 minutes, 2 police cars arrived on scene, their red and blue lights adding to the chaotic light show. 2 officers approached the front door cautiously, their hands on their weapons. One knocked loudly, identifying themselves as LAPD and demanding that the door be opened. No response. The lights continued their violent flickering. One of the neighbors, a retired lawyer named Robert Chen, called out that he had Aubrey's cell phone number from the neighborhood watch contact list. He dialed it on speakerphone so everyone could hear. It rang 6 times, then went to voicemail. That's when one of the police officers received a call on his radio. Elena couldn't hear what was said, but she saw his expression change from alertness to confusion. The officer lowered his radio and turned to address the gathered neighbors. "We're being told that Miss Plaza is currently in New York City. She's been there for the past 3 days for press appearances. The house should be empty." A cold silence fell over the group. If Aubrey wasn't home, then who, or what, was inside? What had screamed? What was causing the lights to behave so violently? The officers obtained authorization to enter the property to check for intruders. Using the key from a lockbox that Aubrey's assistant provided the code for, they unlocked the front door and entered cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the still flickering interior lights. Elena and the other neighbors waited outside, straining to hear or see what was happening inside. The officers were inside for approximately 12 minutes, an eternity for the frightened people gathered on the street. When they finally emerged, both looked shaken. One was on his radio immediately, requesting a supervisor to respond to the location. The other officer addressed the neighbors, his voice carefully controlled. "There's no one inside," he announced. No signs of forced entry, no intruders, no indications of any disturbance. But Elena could see something in his eyes, something he wasn't saying. When she later managed to speak with him off the record, after weeks of persistent but respectful requests, he told her what they'd really found inside. Deep scratch marks. Dozens of them, running along the inside of the staircase that led from the ground floor to the second story. The marks were gouged into the wood and drywall, some of them over an inch deep, arranged in sets of 3 and 4 parallel lines as if something with claws had dragged itself up the stairs. The pattern suggested upward movement, the officer told her, speaking on condition of complete anonymity. Like something had crawled from the first floor to the second floor, its claws digging into every surface for purchase. But here's what made it impossible: the marks were on the inside of the staircase walls, the parts that would be impossible for a human to reach while climbing the stairs. You'd have to be on the wrong side of the wall to make those marks. The officer also mentioned that the electrical panel in the house showed no signs of malfunction. Every breaker was in perfect working order. There was no logical explanation for the violent flickering that dozens of witnesses had observed. And most disturbingly, when they reached the second-floor hallway, the same hallway where Elena and her daughter had seen shadows moving, they found that the temperature was at least 15 degrees colder than the rest of the house, despite no windows being open and the HVAC system functioning normally. "One more thing," the officer had added, his voice dropping lower. "This doesn't go in any official report, but both of us felt it. The entire time we were in that house, we felt like we were being watched. Not by security cameras, we checked, and she doesn't have any interior cameras. We felt like something was observing us, following us from room to room, staying just out of sight. My partner, who's been on the force for 19 years and has cleared hundreds of buildings, told me afterward that he's never felt anything like that. He said it felt actively malevolent, like whatever presence was there resented our intrusion and was considering whether to let us leave. This information never made it into the official police report. The incident was documented as a possible electrical malfunction that had resolved itself, with a recommendation that the homeowner have her electrical system inspected. The scratch marks were attributed to an animal, possibly a raccoon, that had somehow gotten into the house and panicked trying to escape. But Elena knew better. And so did everyone else who had been there that night. The final piece of Elena's testimony was delivered with visible reluctance, her silhouette shifting uncomfortably in the chair as she prepared to share the detail that had ultimately pushed her to come forward with this interview. 2 days before Aubrey went on that talk show and made her confession, Elena said slowly, "Something happened that I've never told anyone. Not even my husband. I saw something. It was late afternoon." Elena had been sorting through mail in her living room when she happened to glance toward Aubrey's house. The angle of the sun at that time of day created a clear view into the actress's second-floor hallway through her large landing window. And there, standing perfectly still in that hallway, was a figure. It was tall, Elena said, her distorted voice trembling slightly. Taller than any person should be. Maybe 7 feet, maybe taller. It was hard to judge scale through the window. And it was thin. Not just slim, emaciated, skeletal, like something that had been stretched beyond normal human proportions. The figure stood in profile, its head tilted slightly to one side in a posture that Elena described as listening. It didn't move. It simply stood there, its attention focused on something Elena couldn't see. "I could see it clearly," Elena insisted. This wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was a solid, three-dimensional figure. And while I couldn't make out fine details from that distance, I could see that it was wearing something dark, like a coat or cloak that hung off its frame in tattered strips. Elena watched for perhaps 30 seconds, frozen in her own doorway, unable to look away from the impossible sight. The figure never moved, never turned its head, just maintained that eerie listening posture. Then a car passed on the street outside, and the brief distraction made Elena glance away for perhaps 2 seconds. When she looked back, the hallway was empty. Her immediate thought was that Aubrey had returned home without Elena noticing, and that this was some tall guest or perhaps a decorator measuring the space. But when Elena checked, Aubrey's car wasn't in the driveway. The house appeared empty. More disturbingly, Elena had a clear view of Aubrey's front door from her position, and she hadn't seen anyone enter or leave. The house was locked, she'd watched the police check 2 nights later. There was no one inside, and yet she had seen that figure as clearly as she'd see a living person standing in that hallway. "I tried to rationalize it," Elena said. "Maybe it was a coat rack that had fallen at a weird angle. Maybe it was shadows from the window blinds creating an illusion. But I know what I saw. That was something standing in her hallway. Something that shouldn't exist." The timing was what convinced Elena that she needed to speak out. 2 days after she saw that figure, Aubrey Plaza appeared on a talk show and made her bizarre confession about living with something paranormal in her home. The audience laughed. The internet memes were created within hours. Everyone assumed it was a joke, another example of Aubrey Plaza's famous deadpan humor. But Elena knew it wasn't a joke. She knew that Aubrey was telling the truth, that she was actually crying out for help in the only way she could, by hiding her genuine terror behind the persona everyone expected from her. She wasn't looking for attention, Elena said firmly. She was trying to warn people. Or maybe she was documenting what was happening to her, getting it on record before whatever happens next. When asked why she waited so long to come forward, Elena's response was painfully honest. "Fear," she admitted. "Fear that people would think I was crazy. Fear that speaking about it might draw that thing's attention to my own family. And fear that no one would believe me anyway, that they'd dismiss me as some attention-seeking neighbor trying to ride on a celebrity's coattails." But the fear of staying silent had eventually outweighed her other fears. Because in the weeks following Aubrey's talk show appearance, things had gotten worse. The scratching sounds had returned, louder and more frequent. The shadows in Aubrey's upstairs hallway were now visible even at night, darker patches of black that moved against the already dark interior. Neighbors reported seeing lights flickering in patterns that seemed almost like they were trying to communicate something. And Aubrey herself, on the rare occasions when anyone saw her, looked exhausted. Haunted. Like someone carrying an impossible burden that was slowly crushing her. Whatever she lived with, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper despite the distortion, it wasn't done with her. I don't think it will ever be done with her. And that's why I'm talking now, why I'm risking people thinking I'm insane or seeking attention. Because somebody needs to know the truth. Somebody needs to understand that what Aubrey Plaza confessed to on that talk show wasn't a joke or a publicity stunt. She paused for a long moment, and the interviewer waited silently, knowing there was more. It was a cry for help, Elena finally said. And we all missed it because we were too busy laughing. The interview concluded shortly after that. Elena declined to answer any follow-up questions, stating that she'd said everything she intended to say. She refused compensation for her time, insisting that she wasn't doing this for money or exposure, but simply because the truth needed to be told. As the crew was packing up their equipment, Elena offered one final comment, off the record but captured on the still-running audio recorder. You asked me earlier if I believe in ghosts or demons now, after everything I've witnessed, she said quietly. I don't know what to believe. I don't know what that thing in her house is or where it came from. But I know this, it's real. It's not imagination, it's not psychological, it's not some elaborate hoax. Whatever Aubrey Plaza is living with, it exists. And the scariest part is, I don't think she can get away from it. I think it's attached to her somehow, that it's chosen her for reasons we can't understand. And God help her, Elena added, because I don't think anyone else can. If this is what her neighbors witnessed from the outside, imagine what Aubrey herself hasn't told the world yet. The scratching sounds that have only gotten worse. The shadows that now appear even in broad daylight. The figure in the hallway that keeps returning. This story isn't over. In fact, according to sources close to the actress, the activity has intensified since her public confession. It's as if speaking about it gave it permission to be more bold, more visible, more aggressive. Subscribe to hear the next part, before the truth gets buried. Because there are people who don't want this story getting out. People who have a vested interest in keeping the public ignorant about what's really happening in that house. And trust me, what's coming next will change everything you thought you knew about Aubrey Plaza's confession.